Uh, Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining this session. I'm excited to chair this session at the Cafe Climate and Health Conference. A special thanks to the Cafe team for inviting us and helping put this together, and a very special thank you as well to the C40 team and the Center for City Climate Policy and Economy. If those of you who don't know about the C40 Center, it creates an amazing journal that is perfectly attuned to this conversation, helping to support evidence-based research for policymakers in the climate space. And a new journal edition on climate and health is coming out soon. I haven't introduced myself yet. My name is Dan Zarrilli. I'm a special advisor here at Columbia University on climate and sustainability, helping the Columbia team create its world-leading Columbia Climate School, as well as supporting the campus's own climate action and sustainability work here. And this question of policy impact and research-based policy impact, of course, is front and center in our minds at the Climate School on how we can take the insights and research and academic work happening here on climate and bring it out into the world in new ways. And so I think this is a really important conversation. Even before joining Columbia, this was a topic that was near and dear to my heart. Before joining Columbia, I served as New York City's Chief Climate Policy Advisor and Chief Resilience Officer, basically across 8 years and 2 mayors. And the work that we did in New York City, whether it was around resilience investments or building decarbonization and Local Law 97 that we passed, work on clean energy transmission, environmental justice, the whole range of things that we were able to accomplish here in New York City. All of it was based on the interaction and collaboration between academia and research and the policy work that we were doing. And a lot of that lived very specifically through a relationship with the New York City Panel on Climate Change, which was an amazing decade-old body of academics that helped support policy impact in New York City, and is a really important model. Maybe we'll get to a little bit more conversation on that in a bit. But joining me for this conversation today, we have a great group of panelists who really occupy a variety of spaces alongside this spectrum of policymakers to academics, with some of our panelists actually having sort of dual roles or operating in the middle ground in between those two areas. I think this is a great group that we've got to have this conversation. And so during our time together, we're going to have this conversation around how academics and practitioners and policymakers work together, how cities in particular can rely on information for policymaking that comes out of universities and the academy and research, and how academics can engage in this process in effective ways. How we talk about research, how we engage, the collaboration and partnership that's necessary for that to work. And so we're going to have, I think, a really interesting conversation with these panelists about this topic, hopefully with the idea of taking away some sense of research priorities and some real key takeaways that we can move forward on together on this topic. So with that, so we're gonna hear from our panelists. I think they're going to introduce themselves in more depth, and I'm going to give them each about 5 or so minutes to talk through their perspectives on this topic. We'll have a discussion, and there'll be time for Q&A at the end of this. And I'm told that our Zoom link, just as it turned on exactly at 1 o'clock, I'm told it turns off exactly at 2 o'clock. So we'll wrap up before then as well. Again, with that, let's like to hear from our panelists, and joined by an amazing group. We've got Pete Daw with us, the head of climate change for the City of London, David Hondula, the chief heat officer with the Office of Heat Response and Mitigation in Phoenix, Arizona. Francesca Di Donato is the manager of the Italian Heat Health Early Warning System, and Lucy Hutyra, an academic researcher at Boston University. And I think we've got a real I think you can see already that we've got such a great group of perspectives here from policymakers, practitioners, and academics, and really looking forward to this conversation. So I think we're going to start with Pete. I'm going to turn it over to you, share a little bit about your work and perspectives on this interaction between academia and policymaking. And yeah, the floor is yours, Pete.
Thank you. Thanks, Daniel, and very nice to see you. And you'll probably guess it's towards the end of the day for me. So I did look as fresh and smart as everyone else at the start of the day. This is what you'll look like in 7 hours, I guess, or well, 5 hours, right? Anyway, a real pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me. Just quickly, a little bit about me. As Daniel sort of mentioned, I head the climate change team for the Greater London Authority. So that's the metropolitan area of London, a city of just under 10 million people when you use that particular boundary. And I have sort of three main sort of areas I focus on. One is net zero. So the mayor's set a 2030 net zero target, very, very challenging, but also I would say very exciting, something that opens up a realm of possibilities as a sort of policy maker, if you like, and an opportunity to really push politicians to do more in this space. So really something I welcome. I think the courage of politicians to set bold and ambitious targets. Second area I work on is climate change adaptation as well. So sort of principal challenges facing London, like many cities, in fact, around surface water flooding is becoming an increasing issue, much like it is in New York. We also have threats from coastal flooding, but are kind of better prepared for that due to previous challenges we've had with flooding going back 50 or 60 years now. We have the Thames Barrier there, challenges around heat and drought as well. One of the things people don't appreciate, I think, about London, yes, it's cloudy, but it's not quite as rainy as people think. It's in fact, it receives less rainfall than every Australian capital city per year, to give you an idea, less than Tel Aviv as well. So I think the sort of stereotype of London is not quite the same as the reality. It's actually quite an arid place, relatively speaking. And the final area, if I haven't got enough with those two, is around green finance as well. So, you know, we need to mobilize lots of money into this space. How can we best do that? I've just been asked to talk a little bit about how we make decisions in London. I thought that was it sounds a really easy question, but in fact is quite a difficult one to answer. Honestly, I would say there's cities are complicated places. There are lots of motivations and you know, there's a sort of balancing of priorities, balancing of sort of short-term political needs with sort of long-term challenges we face. So the sorts of things, you know, we're thinking about when we're making decisions are things like, you know, really looking, you know, given the sort of limitations on our own budgets and powers and resources, you know, where can we get our biggest bang for buck? So looking to identify co-benefits, so things like air quality, health, climate, tackling other inequalities, are really sort of powerful and resonate with us. So where can we have the greatest impact for the investment we're going to make? Just to illustrate that point, we've done quite a lot of work around looking at sort of climate vulnerabilities in London. So mapping those sort of climate risks at basically very, very local sort of areas of London, and also then mapping social factors against that. So, you know, who is most vulnerable? Can we identify then where, as well as where we can have biggest bang for buck in terms of different policies, where can we have greatest impact, where it's most needed, you know, where the most vulnerable populations are as well. So it's just an example of how we're sort of approaching this topic in London. We also obviously think about where we have the greatest power to act. So I'll talk a little bit about the ultra low emission zone in a second, but the mayor has stronger powers related to transport, where we basically operate the London transport system, and also in terms of sort of large developments in the city, we have far weaker powers in other areas. So we're thinking about where we can have maximum impact and where we can sort of utilize the mayor most effectively. Also, where are the gaps? Where is government not playing in the city space? Where are the big holes? What's the role we can play in sort of convening others to do more as well? But yeah, underneath all of that as well, obviously, I would hope it goes without saying we need a sort of good and strong evidence base to sort of support the decisions we make. And obviously, academia plays a really important role in helping us, sort of make that case. So, I mean, just turning to the ultra low emission zone and air quality in London, I think there's a sort of long history of us working with academia in this space. We're lucky, we have a very good and extensive local air quality monitoring network, which has been run for a number of years by London universities, which provides that sort of evidence of what's happening in London, and that's been in play for probably almost 30 years now. That's been there. Really important to have that evidence, and over time we have worked with academia. So we have really strong academics in Imperial College and King's College in London in particular on air quality to basically understand the impact of air quality on Londoners and on their health, to start to predict then the number of deaths being caused by air pollution. We started in that space looking at PM10 back in 2008. We had a sort of figure at that time of about 4,300 deaths, which sort of helped really present and make that argument compelling for us to start to intervene much more. So turning an environmental issue into a health issue has been a really powerful thing, and that's required sort of evidence from those academic institutions to bring in that credibility. We then grew that out to talk about NO2 for the first time in about 2015, and then also PM 2.5, and that work kind of continues. So it's constantly ongoing, that assessment of the impacts on health of air quality, and that's been really front and center of making that argument for the ultra low emission zone. So starting with a small part of London, so the very center of London, the ultra low emission zone essentially is a tool which stops the most polluting cars and vehicles entering the zone. They can enter, but they pay a very significant fine if they do, and we support that with a range of sort of scrappage schemes where organisations and people can essentially scrap their car and get a contribution to a cleaner one. That over time has sort of changed. We grew that back in 2021 to sort of the inner London sort of ring roads, so about 18 times bigger than that central zone, and it's currently just expanded actually to cover the entire city. And I think part of that sort of making that case has really involved having the sort of health experts and academia right behind helping us make the argument for air pollution as a sort of health issue. I think without that, we wouldn't have the credibility really to sort of take forward policies such as this. And I'll just finally quickly finish by just mentioning the importance of other cities here as well. It's difficult, you'll probably hear from others as well, for cities to sort of act alone or be the first and be the only city doing things. It helps when other cities have done something and you can learn from it, or sort of share that knowledge and the learnings from how you go about this stuff, how you build that sort of policy base to go forward. So just a quick shout out to C40 in particular in the space, who we've worked very, very closely with for a number of years, who have been sort of really, really crucial for us, both in sharing our own learning with other cities, so Milan and others who are sort of looking at similar issues, but also in sort of helping us understand and identify other opportunities we can take. So I'll pause there, mindful of what you said, Dan, about an hour, and let other people have a chance to join.
Thanks, Pete. That's a great point too about how cities work together, and maybe our experience in New York City was a little different because I had a boss that always wanted to be able to say how what we were doing was the first, the biggest, the best. But it all, of course, relied on that evidence basis to be able to pull it off. David, I want to turn to you, and I've watched with interest a lot of the media you've done, and particularly over last summer during some of the heat waves. I think these questions of how you communicate risk and how that communication informs policy is really interesting. And I would love to turn to you to introduce yourself and talk about your perspectives on this.
Yeah, thanks, Daniel, and thanks to you and Quinn and the C40 and Cafe team for putting this together. You're a real honor to be with you. Dave Hondula here in a cool and rainy Phoenix, although it's not that way all the time. In fact, as we were hearing from London there, I was starting to second guess if Phoenix was actually a wetter place than London, but I don't think that's the case. Working, as it was mentioned, in our Office of Heat Response and Mitigation. Daniel, to your point, trying to claim the first, the biggest, the best. We do believe Phoenix was the first to name a publicly funded office focused on heat, at least in the United States. But of course, there's great leadership and activity happening in the heat space, and in cities all across the world. And C40 has really been instrumental in bringing us together and advancing that dialogue. I think our office and other heat leaders in municipal governments across the country are emerging or becoming recognized because we haven't had our eye on the heat challenge as well as we could have in the past. I think there's been a sense that everybody's probably working a little bit on the heat problem, but it's not well organized, it's not well consolidated, it's not understood whose primary responsibility it is. We had plenty of meetings where we knew people were attending the heat coordination meeting outside of their work hours or above and beyond their job description. And if everybody's volunteering, we're probably not tackling the challenges as rigorously as we could. So we've changed that model in Phoenix. We now have a team of 7 working in the heat office to try to advance citywide thinking, strategizing around long-term solutions for heat, your tree planting, your reflective surfaces, all of that, as well as the short-term strategies of opening and operating cooling centers and handing out water bottles and that public messaging you mentioned as well, Daniel. So we do see a really wide spectrum we see the heat problem as a big one, a very intersectional one, which it makes it a fun challenge and creates a lot of diversity in the schedule on a day-to-day basis. As we heard so clearly from London, evidence has to be a part of those discussions, whether it's figuring out where the trees should be planted or which cooling centers we want where we want a cooling center to operate next summer. And our academic partners have certainly been an important part of that. And as you alluded to, Daniel, I transitioned into the city role from a background in academia, and I've actually been a little bit frustrated with the 5-year ago version of me, the 10-year ago version of me, thinking surely this data set exists, surely this map exists. Like, it must have come out of our research. It's so obvious. It's such a clear need, but it didn't answer a research question at the time. So it never got investigated. The value was not in generating the simple descriptive statistics of tree coverage by city council district or by land ownership area, right? That didn't fit the research agenda. And it's a question we might hear all the time from an elected official or a policymaker. So I find myself filling in this middle ground where there are research questions that have been answered very, very elegantly with very sophisticated models, but some simpler questions that maybe haven't been answered, or at least we forget about where the answers are. So you provided, Daniel, a couple of questions. What has relied on scientific evidence? And so some of the initiatives I mentioned, well, where to do heat programs, whether it's operating cooling centers, planting trees, incentivizing cool roofs. There are different modeling tools, analytical tools that we are using from academia and other partners. And I do find myself asking, at what point are these tools good enough? I'm sure my fellow academics can empathize with the idea that we always feel like we can improve the precision, improve the accuracy, get another decimal point out of the model. But how does that factor into the implementation realities we face when there might only be 8 options in terms of the buildings that we can choose to do something? And where is that sweet spot in good enough is a question I find myself asking a lot these days that I was never really thinking about 5 years ago. And those implementation realities in general, I would love to hear questions and ideas from the panelists and other discussions. How do we get the implementation realities into our academic models and thinking and so on? I feel like, now a couple of years in the city job, there's just so much about maintenance and property and ownership that we don't talk about, we don't see in the academic literature very much. The last point, Daniel, just to try to keep us on track. I feel like I'm in a pretty good position. I trained in academia, from academia, now working in a city role that values evidence. And I still don't know how to bring all of the great research that's happening to bear in the context of our city work. There's so much of it, and it's so rich and so complex. How are we able to distill it down? Whose job is it to bring that research to us? I even just from our neighboring institution here, Arizona State University, so much happening in the space, I find it hard to keep up with. And that's just one of thousands of universities. And then, of course, we'll read papers, studies done of Phoenix from elsewhere around the country, around the world, that we never know about until we find by happenstance. So I'm really interested to hear people's ideas about how to build and grow that pipeline, to share language, to share knowledge. It feels like there is a tremendous amount of missed opportunity there that I find very frustrating on a day-to-day basis. And if we can make just a little dent in it, I think could make a huge difference. Daniel, thanks again. Looking forward to the dialogue.
No, really important points, and thank you for that. I'm always struck by this this idea that there's so much that happens in the university, as you point out, and yet it doesn't translate over, or it gets published and people wonder why it didn't get read and implemented, and policymakers on the other side may have priorities and they go looking for evidence to support their prior perspectives. And something's got to bridge that gap, and hopefully some more of this conversation gets to how to even better do that. Francesca, turning to you, please, would love you to introduce yourself and talk about your work with the Italian heat health monitoring system.
Yes, thank you, Daniel, and thanks to the organizers for organizing and inviting me to this really incredible event. I think the discussion is going to be very interesting, and I'm glad that I actually come after Pete and David, because I sit in the middle of there somewhere in our department. I come from the Department of Epidemiology in the Lazio Regional Health System. So it's a policy, public health institution, but we are a Department of Epidemiology. So we actually do the research that will help policy. We support policy with the research we carry out. We help public health policymakers, but also public health people working in public health to actually implement the actions that are needed in response to heat specifically, but a whole series of other things. So our role is really to support what policymakers ask and what they need, and transfer and simplify the results from the research as well, because as was said before, there's a lot of research that is actually being carried out, but sometimes it never gets to the policymaker in the format or what they need in that moment as well. And usually it's right at the end of the day, or they're sitting on a policy committee and they need a one-page or some data, and sometimes they can't fish through 50 articles, journals, or do a literature review. They need some information. So that is often our role every day in getting random calls and filling in the gaps or providing the evidence on different topics. We work in environmental epidemiology specifically, and I've been working on climate change and health for over 20 years. Managing the Italian heat warning system and the adaptation plan. Just to give you a bit of background on how it works specifically in Italy. So the minute we work for the Ministry of Health in this context, we manage the heat adaptation plan on their behalf. We run the warning systems, and we've defined the guidance and what should be in a heat adaptation plan, which is a whole series of different things. Obviously, our perspective is very much health focused, being in public health, as it is in several European or cities around the world. Even in the US, I'm currently in LA at the moment, which is not as sunny and warm as it usually is. We've been in a 3-day well, 4-day emergency for flooding and all sorts of things happening over here. So I think it's a good example of climate change actually existing in the context where we are. So if you think of LA being sunny and hot every day, well, it hasn't been in the past 4 days. I think I've never seen it raining so much, not even when I used to live in the UK, just to bring it back to what Pete was saying. But anyway, the other months I've been here have been very sunny, and that doesn't happen in the UK. So I'm quite surprised that London is so dry. I probably wasn't there at the right time. Anyway, so going back to what we do, so the importance of science and academia is, really important throughout the scale of what we've done in the whole process of defining the heat adaptation plan, the warning system. It's reviewing the evidence, consulting with academics and experts on how to carry out and how to develop the warnings, what information should be in there. Warning systems are not just weather forecasts. We have to consider the impacts on health. So how to do that as well has been a challenge and has been done differently throughout the world in different contexts. But it's really important to get these interdisciplinary, dialogues going on, and they have to carry on throughout the definition of plans and policy as well, right? Because if not, it's always going to sit either in the academic world or on the other policy side. So what we've been doing in Italy, from the national system to the very local system, our heat warning systems are city-based, so they are based on the actual, city climate and the city response in terms of health, because we look at the conditions in each city, because it's really important, right? They're the ones that are living the heat waves every summer, and the impacts are different in each city. And we need to take that into account, especially when we're defining response measures and actions. It can't be one fits all. It has to be localized. So there needs to be a continuous engagement between what the science provides and what should be there and what the policymakers actually need and what can be implemented. It's no use having something that they're never going to be able to implement. So what we've done over the years, it's been a very ongoing and challenging process that has changed and shifted over time, but that's how it should be, right? And it improves with further evidence, further ways of doing things, improving the analytical and the methodological tools. But it has been an ongoing process of dialogue between policymakers, stakeholders, public health institutions and organizations at very different levels. So one of the messages that I would really like to portray here is that it's important that from the policy side, because you need a policy base to have things going, but it has to be at different levels. So you need the national, the regional, and the very local. And again, within cities as well, it has to be even more localized. If you think of local health authorities, London or any big city that we all live in doesn't only have one local health authority, for example, or there's different municipalities or districts, and they all need to be engaged. And even communities within a population of a city need to be engaged for the different aspects that are involved. If you think of vulnerable groups to heat that was mentioned before, the evidence we've had over the years, and it continues to be updated and change over time, and that needs to be updated constantly, and we need to engage with different practitioners, different emergency responders, different parts of policy as well that needs to be engaged. And it is a very, flexible and ongoing process, and setting all that up is a challenge, but I think it's very rewarding when you get to that stage, because then it can be used in the wider context of climate change, not only for heat, because you can apply the same framework or the same structure of how you've done it, of engaging between academia and going, this backwards and forwards constantly, that is really useful to then get things implemented and for them to become standardized, right? Because if you see them now, you think, oh, they've had it up in place, it must have been easy. No, it hasn't. It's an ongoing process and it changes. And I think that's the beauty and the challenge of it as well. Rome recently has been working a lot, the city of Rome, not our office, but we're obviously involved with it, on the new adaptation strategy for the municipality of Rome, which I think has been a tremendous effort and has put together so many people, and it will be a challenge in the next year. So I hope they become more engaged with C40 to see how they can learn from the experiences of the other cities and how they can share what they're also planning and what we've been doing as well. So it is an ongoing process, and it is evolving as well from a public health perspective. We started just on heat, and the heat adaptation plan also now includes air pollution as well. To some extent, it's going to probably become, in some other areas, wildfires are an issue in cities in Italy. We've had several wildfires in summer during heat waves, especially last year in Sicily, for example, where there was a tremendous fire in the airport in Catania, for example, which was a challenge during the heat wave for air pollution and a whole series of other things. If you think that the emergency responders and who is engaged in that is always the same people, and who is most at risk, furthermore, are always the same people in the same areas, and they're vulnerable for the same situation. So, there is some overlay in the different things, and the resources are very finite, as we know, not only in public health, but in other emergency services. And I think it's really important that we make the best of what we have. And so this continuous collaboration between science and between the different policymakers, between the different stakeholders, is really important to get this operational to where we want it to go.
Thank you so much for that. I think highlighting some really important points around communication of risk and research, and I think there's a whole conversation there to be had around how to do that effectively, and hopefully to get to some of that in a few minutes. Lucy, I'd like to turn to you to please introduce yourself as on the spectrum of policymaker to academic. I think we've reached the more academic side of the spectrum. Would love to hear your perspectives on this.
Great, thank you for inviting me. And I'm definitely at the end of this spectrum, but maybe not a typical academic. I was trained as a typical academic, purely disciplinary atmospheric science training, and I got impatient. And over the last 20 years, personally, I've, much like David, Hondula, I've wanted to impact policy, and trying to figure out how to do that, and try to address some of David's points about how do we actually get science into cities, and the right kind of science that's packaged in a way that can actually be used. So I'm an academic researcher, but I'm also an educator. And the main way that I've been able to span this spectrum is through my students. And it's my PhD students and PhD students in general that often do most all of the leading academic work within universities. And my students had that same desire to engage with cities, and I was smart enough to get out of their way and make some opportunities for them. It was probably almost 15 years ago that I had my first PhD student intern in City Hall. And that was a transformation for that student and a transformation for me, where the student was fully embedded in city government for a period of time with all the skills that a PhD and hunger that a PhD student has. And it transformed them to the point where other students wanted to do it. And we've now actually created an entire PhD program that has 4 highly specialized skilled PhD students, an opportunity for them to get embedded in cities and nonprofits and work on that translational science. And as an academic, I'm continually learning from them as they're embedded and they're hearing what cities need today, what do they need tomorrow, and how those needs are evolving. And it's really been almost like a user experience where we're constantly getting new information about where the emerging needs in science are. So Daniel asked me to address how academics like myself actually work with cities and how some of the questions are addressed. And I've done that a little bit, but I wanted to offer a more specific example. Some years ago, the city of Boston asked me as an academic to do a third-party evaluation on a controversial development project. In the process, I brought one of my students along with me, and we worked on the analysis. We were guided by the specific questions that the city had, and we worked on answering them. And at the end of the entire experience, we did a brown bag lunch where we shared the process with other departments in the city and shared our findings. And there was an incredibly tenacious employee of the Planning and Redevelopment Agency that asked a really fascinating follow-on question that as a researcher I thought was unanswerable about estimating the heat benefits of different solutions in redeveloping parcels of land in the city. And I didn't know how to answer his question. I didn't know how to solve this problem. And he persisted. And his persistence paid off for him, it paid off for me, and it paid off for the student, where over the course of a dozen conversations, we changed the question a little bit to one that was answerable, but we tackled that need. And that was through those direct conversations where, you know, we often think of cities as monoliths of this vast universe where policy happens, but cities are made up of people. And those people and those one-on-one conversations are a lot of what inspires the actual work and the scientific questions that academics take on. Daniel also asked how can scientific information be effectively conveyed to cities? And I think the answer to that is not the way we normally do it. Normally an academic will publish a paper and they're done. It's out there. All the people that need to find it will find it, and that's just false. They won't find it, even if there's somebody like you know, David, who is coming from that perspective. There's so much out there, and filtering through it is near impossible. A better way, a more effective way, and it's one that I often try to do, is to reach out to the people in the cities and those stakeholders directly and communicate some of what we found and have that conversation about how can it be used, or if it can't be used, why can't it be used, and how can we reconceive it for the next project to be something that's more useful. Maybe I'm an unusual academic, but this experience has made me ask completely different questions than I ever would have imagined. I'm not clever enough to have come up with the questions that the city is actually interested in, and figuring out how to do novel, cutting-edge science while simultaneously providing that information is really key.
Lucy, that's amazing. And I think there's so much insight I want to draw out on that. The you know, as a policymaker, just as maybe an aside, the idea of searching out academic papers was just like completely foreign. Like, just the only I think the only academic papers I ever read as a policymaker in the city was those that got negative press about what we were doing, and therefore I had to dig into it. And so that's just not the way that I think that communication happens. The more important point I think that you just made, what a great example that a policymaker asked you a question, you thought it couldn't be answered, and so you refined it in a different way that could be answered. And this process of getting policymakers together with researchers and academics to ask the questions together really does break that traditional mold of, you know, a researcher does a project or research and publishes a paper, and maybe nobody reads it that should be reading it, versus the policymakers that are searching around looking for the evidence they need to do what they want to do. It's that key critical point of asking the questions together that makes the outcome both policy actionable as well as scientifically defensible. It's an amazing example. I would love to turn, we're getting some questions that come in from the audience. I have a few things I want to just throw to our panel before getting to some of those. But I think, having heard all this, would love to go back to Pete in particular as the sort of far end policy maker on this spectrum. You know, what have you heard, and can you maybe pull out a few more examples from like the ultra low emission zone on, you know, how this sort of evidence base has really helped you do your work differently, and whether anything you heard here is you know, is particularly insightful.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, that's been really really useful to sort of hear. I guess there's a few themes which are really, really important. So I was sort of reflecting on what I heard, and you know, David, it's quite interesting hearing David crossing that sort of spectrum. But I was sort of taken back to when I was a teenager. Let's pretend I was a teenager in 2012 when the Olympics were happening in London, and I had to go off and I spoke at a thing at University College London, and they'd done a piece of work about what London looked like in 2112, 100 years from now. And I was thinking in my head, well, that's 25 mayoral terms, right? That's immediately where my head went. And just, I think getting an understanding and, just the practicality of what is useful is so important. So one of the things around air quality that's been in play for a while is something called April, so air pollution research in London. What that does is bring together academics, it brings together policymakers, and it brings together, I think it's in the chat actually, some more community-based groups as well, to agree an agenda, what's important, and how they can work together to move things on. I've kind of mentioned the importance of having that evidence base. Again, in the chat, there's people asking about how it's best to sort of present this. And I think, Daniel, you've got some experience of this by the sounds of it as well, I'm sure. But, our jobs often is to sort of interpret what can be excruciatingly long and complicated things into a language that politicians can understand and buy into. So, a bit more effort in sort of language and thinking about how you can relate that to sort of real world and, the sorts of things that are across a mayor's desk day to day is incredibly useful. Something we've just set up actually in London, really keen to see how this goes. Another terrible acronym, but London Research and Policy Partnership. This is born out of the pandemic. And one of the things I think we learned was that need to come together across business, academia, local government, regional government, various agencies to work together on some of these challenges. The pandemic really brought that strongly into focus. So what we've got now is a structure there with academia where we can sort of explore and identify those opportunities we're going to work on jointly. So in my area, we're thinking about retrofit and the just transition, for example. But by convening and having those places where policy and academia can talk to each other and start to sort of identify what those opportunities are, I think that's a really important way of sort of driving this forward in a sort of meaningful way.
That's great. Thank you for that, Pete. I'm curious, as well, from both Francesca and David, sort of your reactions to the conversation as it's sort of flown through today, and this concept. I think, David, it was you that brought this up of good enough, and how that plays into, Francesca, your work around this. Whatever. I think we're all grappling with this emerging set of heat risks that our governments are not necessarily set up well to manage, and we're all trying different governance models. How do you deal with the good enough in your communications, Francesca, in the Italian context on heat?
So we were quite, I would say I see it as a good case example. Obviously, it's been hard work. It's been an ongoing process, but I think our advantage in a way was that when we started all the formal heat adaptation plan, it was in 2003, so a while back, and it was a very hot summer. So we always know that policymakers tend to be interested in a topic when something happens, right? If it's not a hot summer, the next year, 2004, was a really cool summer across Europe. So they had that attention at one point and then it had gone, sort of thing. And when you're doing research or policy, you keep going, it's not only, it can come back and stuff. So it's engaging and, portraying the information. I think our advantage was that it also started with really, there was a policy commitment. All the people that needed to be at the table for the discussion were there. So it was civil protection, which in Italy deals with all the emergencies. It's slightly different in other contexts, but in Italy it's a bit, it's like FEMA for the US, but they deal with all the emergencies. And so that becomes something that they manage quite well. And we adopted that scheme of things but then there was policymakers from other stakeholders. There was civil protection, Ministry of Health, local health authorities at different levels as well. And everyone was really saying, as Lucy also pointed out, the importance of getting their questions, knowing what they needed, what is their need, how can they implement it within their policy. And you can't start everything from scratch every time, right? So how are things working in the different contexts? If it's an emergency situation in a city, in a region, if it's public health, if it's social services, you have to really engage with all the different users that are in there and the communities as well, because obviously you need their perspective. So when you're defining how these things work, in the case of the heat adaptation plan, for example, it was a very cohesive and interdisciplinary discussion right from the start. And you need to define who does what, right? And that's the other important thing. It's not, sometimes the remit isn't clear at all levels. I think it was mentioned before. So it's quite hard, easy to set up everything and run the warning system, both from a scientific point of view and an operational point of view, but actually making sure that things get done and who should be doing what at all those different levels is something that we found in the research recently carried out in both European projects and with WHO, is that sometimes it's, it gets a bit lost in translation in terms of who is doing what all the time, or who has, they would like to do it, but then talking to the stakeholders, they say, they might be doing it as an extra activity. It's not formalized. There isn't a proper remit. So even that interaction is quite hard sometimes. So I think it is, you really need to make sure that the policymakers have clear evidence of what the problem is, and you're providing it to them in the way they want as well. So we've been engaging with them all the time, and not only for heat, but for everything we do as our mandate in the Department of Epidemiology. We provide, we make a summary. It might not be a policy brief all the time, but we provide them with some sort of information, and they know that if they, something else comes up, they can just say, hey, we need something on this. What have you got? What is the current evidence? Sometimes, you're well prepared because it's something you've been actually working on and you have all the evidence. Sometimes it isn't. And you have to say, look, I need to review this a minute, or contact all the different people, and you have sort of a network. So I think it's important, like David was saying, that there is an office or people who are dedicated to this work of the, the bridge between the science and the policy. We see it very much from sometimes an academic point of view. I've been working a lot on, transferring knowledge or bridging the gap between science and policy, transferring the information to different users, different policymakers or end users or stakeholders or, vulnerable groups. And it is something that typically academics, they write the research paper and that's it for them. They don't want to go beyond, or they might do a, some sort of policy brief if the project requires it, or I don't know, a newsletter on their website. But I think that's where really there can be a lot more done, both from academia, because as Lucy mentioned, and I'm glad to hear there's more people on that side of the things, because I really think it's tremendously important that, researchers really work on transferring their results to others in a wider context. It can just be the general public, it can be your local policymaker or whatever. That's really important. But on the other hand, policymakers need to engage with it needs to be a bilateral discussion, I think, constantly. And having someone who is dedicated to that, be it in the, in a municipality or in a city council office, or on the other hand, is really important from the different officers. And I think that is, I see that happening. I mean, many cities now have, climate change officers or city officers for heat or whatever. And I think that is really important, and we should, in a way, help that and sustain that flow and provide the information, either if it's the science and the academic side or the other parts, because it's more than one. From a public health point of view, it's also getting the practitioners involved in that discussion.
Yeah. Thank you, Francesca. It's really helpful thoughts on this, and it pulls out this idea that the bridging of that gap, like the more that gets formalized and that there are relationships to draw upon from between both policymakers and academics is just incredibly valuable for both sides to have the kind of impact that they want to have. We have about we have 9 minutes left before this thing shuts off on us. So I would love to hear David and Lucy, any last thoughts? I think there's, looking at the questions coming in, there's a bunch that sort of boil down to, what are the good models for for how academics and policymakers can work together. What challenges have you overcome? What sort of advice would you offer, David, starting with you, to academics who want to do more of this policy engagement work and how to do it effectively? Just a few minutes on that. I would love to hear, Lucy, your thoughts on that, and then we'll probably wrap this up.
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. First, I have to laugh. Just so much of what the other panelists has been really resonating with our experience here. So great job to C40 assembling this group. I was Francesca, as you were talking about the details getting lost in the weeds and hearkening back to some of our experiences last summer. Like, who has the key to open up the box where the ice bags are? But like all the that level of detail and that kind of thinking, getting that into the research environment, I think is important. Daniel, I think my first piece of advice is that people need to talk to Lucy, and Lucy is a celebrated, successful model, and I would guess, and I'm sure she'll elaborate here in a moment. Like, all of the time she has invested in students and doing the listening and the thinking about those city questions, I suspect she sacrificed a lot in terms of other papers that could have been written or other grant applications that could have gone in. And I think there is a legacy attitude in our institutions, which is changing. I think Francesca acknowledged it well, it is changing. But I think there is still this lingering attitude or question that even students might have, is that lesser somehow? And I think this panel feels very much the opposite, that is in fact the greatest role we can play. But I think we need to continue to combat that narrative and really elevate and recognize the successful models. Lucy's concept, this internship program, the National Science Foundation has started something like that. I think we need to put spotlights on these models that are working. Lucy said it very clearly. Once it was happening, it snowballed in a positive direction. I think we need to get more of those snowballs rolling.
Thank you, David. Love that. Talk to Lucy. Good advice.
I don't think it's lesser than at all. I don't think anything that I've done over the last 15 years has been lesser than, or I've sacrificed writing papers. I've just written different papers than I might have written if I hadn't had this voice in my ear asking really interesting questions. And I think what we really need to do from the academic side, and is happening radically, is we need to change educational models. And the students want us to change those educational models. And the program I was describing, Urban is what it's called, is been embraced by our university as a breaking of the model. And we're doing things that PhD students are not supposed to do, and they love it. And I love it. And they're writing papers about it. So the metrics of success in academia are not being compromised. They're just shifting. And an alignment of incentives needs to happen, where academics like me are rewarded in my system for doing what I'm doing. And I'm at a progressive university that has rewarded it. And this, on the city side and on the policy side, it takes time out of people's day to talk to somebody like me. And they need to be rewarded for having invested the time to talk to an egghead academic who doesn't use very understandable words sometimes, because of the good that can come out of it on the other side. So I think it's an alignment of incentives and an acknowledgement of those shifting models.
Lucy, I just want to ask the sort of follow-up question to your point that, in academia, how this gets rewarded is very different, and maybe you're at a different type of place, but I've seen it in other universities where the sort of tenure review committees don't necessarily look kindly on the non-discipline specific work that happens. And you're saying that you haven't had that type of challenge.
I'm saying I haven't had that kind of challenge. I've continued to publish, and you have to publish. That's what academics are evaluated on. It's just what I publish changes. I had a big year. I won a MacArthur award this year, and I won it for breaking these models and succeeding anyway. And I think that, a public acknowledgement of different models for how to succeed and how to collaborate is really important.
That's great.
There's
It's
not
great to
one
hear.
way to put it.
And I'll lift up again the point you made, the the asking the questions together and refining it, so that what you're doing in academia is policy actionable on the policymaker side. It's such an incredible insight that it almost seems obvious, but it isn't always obvious. So we just have a few minutes left here. I don't know if there's either and I see a few more questions that have rolled in the chat. I'm just wondering if I'm scanning quickly to see if there's something we can cover quickly. And I think it's maybe just to go back to Francesca and Pete, of any additional good models for how to bridge these divides. Any last thoughts in just a minute or two, just to get a final thought in. Francesca first, maybe.
That's a tough question for the last minute. Yeah.
Yeah, it is.
I think I wouldn't know. I mean, I think there's some great examples out there from different fields. And I think the other aspect that maybe we could stress is that we have to think outside the box, right? As Lucy was also suggesting, it doesn't have to necessarily be in that specific theme or research line. It can be from other things. We have to, especially for the topic we're looking at for climate change response, if it's health or other sectors, it's so interdisciplinary that we can learn a lot from other sectors as well. And engaging, with others is really important. So I think that would be one thing I would suggest. And I think we can learn a lot from that, and it can be a learning experience for us all.
Thanks. Pete, the last thought?
Yeah, what Francesca said, absolutely. We need to sort of talk to each other more. We need to sort of find common ground and agree sort of areas which we need to sort of explore and bring those different perspectives in on. That involves a range of people, not just academics, not just policymakers. We need to think about communities. There's lots of strength out there. Lots of different tiers of government need to be in this as well. So, just convening and talking and agreeing, broad areas where we need to sort of think harder and work together more creatively seems a very obvious point, but something we're not good enough at doing it.
This is great. Thank you. I want to just do a quick round of thanks for Pete, David, Francesca, and Lucy for joining us today, and for everyone who participated in this. And thanks to the cafe organizers and to C40, Quinn and David Miller, for helping to really organize this. It's been a really helpful conversation. And if I have one last minute before this thing shuts off, the key lesson for me is we need to get policymakers and academics in the room to ask those questions together, so that we're answering the right questions. And I think it seems obvious, and yet it's such a fundamental truth on how we're going to be able to tackle new and emerging challenges that we're dealing with climate change right now. So thank you very much. And I think that's now we're wrapped up. So thank you. And please do check out that C40 journal. I see some links that just came from David in there, and there'll be an upcoming journal edition on these very topics of climate and health. So thank you, everybody.